Hi everybody, good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Mayfa, if we haven't already hit record, if we could hit record now, that would be wonderful. My name is Carolyn Wade and I'm the lead of Educational Leadership Futures, or ELF, as we like to call it, here at Griffith University. For those of you who aren't familiar with ELF, we are a research collective supported by the Griffith Institute for Educational Research, GIER. We bring together academics, higher degree research candidates, and emerging scholars who are advancing the field of educational leadership. Our focus is on how leadership can be reimagined to respond to the complex realities of contemporary education, whether that be in schools as school leaders, in systems, universities, or communities. ELF was founded by Associate Professor Amanda McKay and I last year. And although Amanda has since relocated to QUT, I'm delighted to say she is here with us today. Hi, Amanda. Thank you for your continued support and collaboration. It is so genuinely valued and we can't wait to keep working alongside and learning from and with you in the future. Today's webinar is the first in what we are calling our Principal Wellbeing Research Series, a series of presentations aimed at bringing current research on principal health, safety and wellbeing directly to the people working alongside school leaders. This series is hosted and supported by GIER, and I'd like to acknowledge our Director, Associate Professor Stephen Hodge, and our Associate Professor Jennifer Alford, our Deputy Director of Research, are here in the audience today. Thank you for your ongoing commitment and support of this work. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which Griffith University campuses are located. I'm joining you today from our Nathan campus, which is in the land of the Yagara, Jagara and Turrbal peoples. Griffith University acknowledges the people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and learn. The land our campuses are on have long been places of learning and of teaching, and we benefit and take forward the responsibility from learning in and on this place. We pay respect to the elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So, welcome to our webinar today, Invisible Labour, Principles Emotional Labour in Volatile Times. This is the first time this research is being presented in Queensland, and we are so pleased to be the ones facilitating this conversation. The timeliness of this work cannot be overstated. What is being asked of school leaders right now and the toll it is taking demands our attention. This session is a really important step in bringing the research and the evidence directly to the people who are working with and alongside our school leaders. So before I introduce our presenters, I actually want to take a moment to acknowledge the remarkable breadth of people who have registered for this session. We have over 60 people registered to attend today, and although we've received some apologies, and I'm also mindful that we have teams of people coming together from one device, the diversity of the audience tells us something really important about the research and the reach and relevance of this work. We have school leaders from Queensland, both principals and assistant principals. We have principal consultants and school leaders from Brisbane Catholic Education, the Department of Education Queensland, and also Independent Schools Queensland. Thank you for being here and welcome. We have workplace health and safety teams. We have directors of principal health and wellbeing. We have members and leads of rehabilitation teams. We have presidents of states and national associations of state school principals who are advocating for school leaders in this space. We have workplace psychology consultants, and we also have colleagues who are in dedicated roles supporting our school leaders every day. Welcome and thank you for being here. We also have aspiring and emerging leaders. We have HDR candidates, we have researchers, and we have academics, not just here from Griffith, but also from other Australian universities. Every one of you brings a perspective that matters to this conversation, and welcome. We are so glad that you're here. Now, let me introduce you, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to the presentation and our presenters. Today's session will present a project that examines the emotional and affective dimensions of principals' work in socially and politically volatile times, drawing on 4 recently released reports from a 4-year Australian Research Council study of Australian school principals' emotional labour. The presentation highlights key findings from this work, in which principals share critical incident testimonies detailing their professional and personal responses to escalating pressure and crises. These accounts make visible the often hidden affective and ethical dimension of school leadership. Now, I included a link to the project website in some of the email invitations that were sent out, but I've also included it on the screen here for you. Look, a simple Google search of the title of our webinar today will bring you up to the Monash website, where you can access more information about this project and also access and download these reports. Our presenters today are Professor Jane Wilkinson. Jane is a Professor of Educational Leadership from Monash University. Professor Lucas Walsh. Lucas is a Professor of Education Policy and Practice at Monash University, and also Dr. Fiona Longmuir, who is a Senior Lecturer in Educational Leadership at Monash University. Although Associate Professor Christine Grice from the University of Sydney was scheduled to present today, unfortunately, she is unwell and sends her apologies. But thank you, Christine, for the work you did behind the scenes in making this happen. I sincerely thank all of our presenters for their willingness to share this important work with us today. Just a couple of really quick housekeeping points before we begin. You'll notice that the comments function has been turned off for this session. Sometimes it can be a little bit distracting as a presenter, but even also as an audience member to see a running commentary of the presentation appear before you on the screen. So that function has been turned off. However, I do encourage you to use the Q&A function that you can see on the top of your screen there. You're welcome to post questions either during the presentation or towards the end. Even if you post them, they won't be published until the end as we move into our Q&A. So these will be collated, and time permitting, after the presentation, we'll make sure we have a wide variety of questions to pose to our presenters. As I mentioned earlier, this session is being recorded, and you are welcome to have your cameras on or off, however you feel most comfortable. But welcome, thank you, and I'll hand over now to Fiona.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. Thank you to ELF for the invitation to present our work today. We're really grateful to have this opportunity to speak to everyone that's in the audience and share what we've been doing with you. So Carolyn's given us a little bit of an overview of the project, a 4-year project that we've been working on. Funded by the Australian Research Council through the Discovery Projects scheme, finishing up this year. So as Carolyn has mentioned, we've delivered 4 reports and we're in the process of thinking more about our work and sharing and discussing it broadly. This project has been led by us at Monash University and by Professor Jane Wilkinson in collaboration with some colleagues from Deakin and from the University of Sydney. And at that point, actually, I would like to add my acknowledgement of country from all of the campuses of our universities where we've lived, worked and learnt while we've done this research, and acknowledge that I'm coming today from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations. So our focus has been on this idea of principals' emotional labour, and our premise was that this wasn't something that was particularly well understood, and so we've sought to really dive into that. We committed in this work to focus specifically on public schools for the main reason that we felt that public schools carry a specific intensity in terms of the work of principal leaders. They cater for the majority of students who are classified as perhaps coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. So we know from other research that they carry a lot of burden in terms of social justice and equity outcomes, and so we're particularly interested in their work and committed to supporting the work of public school leaders through our project. Our research methods have come in a couple of phases. One of the most significant pieces of that has been some critical incident testimonies, which were anonymous surveys of principals designed to collect their feelings about emotionally intense moments in their leadership work. We've also done a pretty comprehensive policy review focused on the kinds of policy settings and arrangements across the country in terms of support for principals in this kind of work. We've done a comprehensive set of stakeholder interviews with people from unions and principal associations, departments, and many, I think about 40 odd, I think we've got the numbers a little bit, representatives that support principals' work in their work. And then we've done 4 case studies as well in particular school sites to really get to the kind of daily work of principals and their emotional labour in that daily work. Last point there, that is our activist methodology. So we committed right from the start to have this kind of stance where we really wanted to work closely with stakeholders. We wanted to be able to offer ways to raise the voice of principals in terms of this less discussed aspect of their work, and that's led us to have lots of consultations and connections, which I will share with you shortly. First of all, what do we mean by emotional labour? It's been a concept that has been discussed mostly by critical feminist scholars who have looked at the kinds of work that is being done. The original work by Ali Hochschild looked at the work of airline hostesses and people in service industries particularly, to think about the way that they had to manage their emotions for a wage, essentially. As that sense. The kind of crux of the idea that we've been engaging with is that pinch between what we think we should feel, what's accepted, what's expected, and what we actually feel in terms of our work. I'm going to click through all of these just so I don't miss anything again. Our studies research questions. So we've been interested in how emotional labour is currently understood and experienced, as I said, by public school principals in particular. What broad and specific contextual and personal factors are significant in understanding this component of the work? And then we've been looking at the theoretical and practical tools that can help to better understand, prepare and support principles and systems to navigate what we're seeing as the increasingly complex and demanding work that the principals are engaged in. And I'm sure you're all familiar with some of those demands and complexities. So as I mentioned, we have had a pretty significant breadth of evidence and data that we've brought together, but also as part of, as I said, that activist kind of approach, lots of connections and discussions with principal actors and principal stakeholders. So our testimonies, that critical incident testimony, which we used kind of a survey, a very open-ended qualitative survey methodology to gather responses from principals about a particular time in their career where they'd experienced a heightened sort of emotional incident. We didn't quite get to 300 testimonies. 256 principals shared a testimony with us. Many of them wanted to share more than one incident, which was great. As I mentioned, we've had that significant engagement, 28 stakeholder interviews that I spoke about, and the 4 case studies that we've done. We've also been really blessed, I think, and lucky, and it's been an incredibly important component of our work to have a really strong industry advisory board where we had representatives from the federal government, some state representatives as well, and as well as practicing principals in that group that have worked with us throughout the whole project to help us make it as activist and impactful as possible. And of course, also we've had an international academic reference group, which has been really helpful as well. Just a quick overview. We have had quite a breadth. This is related to the testimony collection. So those 256 principles came from a broad range of contexts, including across states and types of school, all public school principals, of course, but we were really pleased as well to have a pretty good representation from across regional and rural locations. And as you can see there, it was a nice mix. As we mentioned, we've delivered 4 reports on the work. These reports have been informed primarily by the critical incident testimonies at this point, and they've been delivered over the last few months and involve lots of connection with stakeholders there as well. So the first report, all these reports are available on our website if you'd like to get hold of those and have a look. The first one was the technical report, talking about the methodology and our approaches. Report 2, particularly looking at how emotional labour impacts individuals' principals' work. And we're going to talk through some of these themes shortly. Report 3 focused on schools as sites of emotional labour, talked about escalating violence and other aspects of the kinds of things that we were seeing happening in schools. And report 4, talking about emotional labour within broader systems and the ways that we do schooling. So as an overview, first of all, some of the things that we have seen really clearly in our findings so far. I'm going to hazard a guess that lots of these maybe not a surprise to some people, but we're really, grateful and excited to be able to share these. Excited in a way that is productive and generative, not excited because they're necessarily good findings, but great that we're being able to have these conversations. So, of course, our research has supported lots of other research that's suggesting that schools as workplaces are becoming increasingly unsafe for principals. We know from the Victorian Auditor General's report recently that 48% of principals here in our state of Victoria, their work cover claims were related to mental health concerns. So we know that is an increasing challenge. We've seen really strong and interesting evidence that suggests principals are acting as first responders in critical incidents. And it's not something that's necessarily been prevalent or talked about a lot in policy or in the ways that we think about or prepare principals. So that's been an important and interesting finding. As part of that, as well as the initial critical responses, that kind of first responder role, they're also managing often long and complex and detailed aftermath of incidents. In our analysis of the critical incident testimonies, over 2/3 of them included some indications of violence. We found principals are finding parents increasingly challenged. We found significant evidence that principals' personal lives are being impacted. It's really incredibly challenging for principals to draw the line between their work at schools and home. And there was a whole range of physical, mental, emotional impacts that happened into their family and personal lives. And our evidence also suggested that principals often have this feeling that their employer, the system for whom they work, does not necessarily care about their experiences and is not acting in a way that that presents them with the care that they need to be able to manage these critical times. All right, so we're going to delve a little bit deeper into our thematic kind of division of our results, and these themes were spread across the three reports that I spoke about, report 2, 3 and 4. I'm going to share some information about theme 1 and then hand over to my colleague Lucas. So theme 1 in that report, we really talked about this notion of the challenges of wearing a professional mask. So this notion of wearing a professional mask is something that we did borrow from Ali Hochschild's work. And it is that idea of having to put on a face, having to think and respond in particular ways that are expected of us. Ali Hochschild talks about this happening in 2 ways. The first one is surface acting, and that's the conscious act that we do when we feel like we have to project calm, or we feel like we have to project enthusiasm, those kinds of emotions where we are putting on a particular way of presenting ourselves in order to manage the emotional climate in which we're working at the time. The polite smile to mask frustration when you're talking to a parent, perhaps. There's also this idea of deep acting. Deep acting is much more ingrained and unconscious. It happens when we are less able to acknowledge, when we don't even notice some of the kinds of contradictions between how we are feeling really and the kinds of projection that we put forward. So things like, presenting deep care for a child, perhaps, who has been acting violently to us. We believe in that work, but actually there's some contradictions and challenges in what we do. So our principal testimony certainly detailed both of these types of wearing a professional mask, and they were crucial to maintaining relationships in their work with parents, other educators and children. Of course, what we're suggesting and what we're seeing in our data is that the intensity of this emotional labour can dominate their work and lead to burnout. And of course, there's all sorts of consequential economic, social and other costs. And ultimately can be very alienating, particularly in the context of not feeling necessarily cared about. Okay, thank you. I'm going to hand to Lucas to continue with theme 2.
Thanks, Fiona. The next area of our work was to explore the diverse geographies of emotional labour. So what this involved was an examination of the context in which principals work and what it meant for their emotional management strategies, how it shaped their identity, and what were the outcomes when it came to their work. So as Fiona mentioned, we were fortunate to have a reasonably good distribution of testimonies from our principals, so we could get a more accurate perspective of the unique kinds of challenges faced, particularly within regional, rural and remote schools. And the data was really striking and very distinctive. And I think one thing to add to what Fiona said and what differentiates our work from other types of work is that we know we've got plenty of data on the challenges faced by principals, the rates of principals attrition and burnout. But for this project, we wanted to look under the hood, to see what's going on inside the minds of principals during critical incidences. And they could be a range of phenomena, from a violent act within a school between students or teachers, through to confronting natural disasters and other emergency events. And of course, principals in regional, rural and remote schools occupy unique roles in their communities, and they're often at the centre of these kinds of challenges that emerge, such as natural disasters, as we've seen in recent years, whether it be flooding in Lismore or the bushfires. We also examine the emotional labour of being an Indigenous principal in a colonial settler nation, leading Indigenous schools as a non-Indigenous principal. And these are explored, and the tensions are explored pretty much at a surface level within our reports, but we intend to go a bit deeper within our scholarly publications coming out of the work. A particular area of interest and concern was the emotional labour of leading within low socioeconomic schools, because as Fiona pointed out, we targeted public schools in the first place because they have to take on all kinds of students. And as we would all know, those in low SES schools face particular and unique challenges, many of which are manifest in heightened forms of emotional labour in the roles of principals in their communities. Next slide, please. Analysis of our data shows a variety of factors contributing to principals' emotional labour in rural and remote context. So part of this role that I want to unpack a bit further for you is the unique role that they play as authority figures, bridge builders, such as managing natural disasters and connecting to communities, connecting the community to services. We've heard from one principal herself who, in the first week on the job, undertook training to respond to cyclones, which was part of the job that she hadn't anticipated in signing up, but was seen to be a necessary part of the role. Imagine if that was part of your job description. Access to resources such as physical infrastructure, human resources such as teachers, specialist personnel and services to support students with complex needs, and isolation that they experience geographically, professionally and personally, which can be exacerbated for inexperienced principals. But we should note here that there are sort of similar themes emerging across the life course of principals, but with particularly intense implications, for example, early career principals. The isolation is a particularly striking one in these smaller regional and remote communities because who does the principal turn to when there's a delicate matter going on, when the entire town knows each other? And how must the principal navigate that in terms of their surface and deep acting? Next slide, please. So I'll read this out to you. Normally we put it up and have a read along with me, but here's an example of a testimony from a rural female secondary principal. After a particular event, the community was reeling. Our students were angry. Support was offered at the time for a couple of weeks by what I like to call fly-in, fly-out wellbeing workers. But the principal wanted additional support in relation to wellbeing for student and staff. There was nothing. Finally, a youth engagement officer sent me a link to a whole of community approach to mental illness, mental health, and had the potential to make a difference. I was able to work with a group of year 8s again and tell them that they were never forgotten. But as you can read there, the experience was harrowing, and a particular theme, a steady drumbeat beating throughout the research, was this feeling of helplessness, of being out of one's depth, but importantly, feeling unsupported by the system. And there were positive examples of where system interventions worked. We want to see those exceptional practices become common practice. But in this feeling of helplessness, this particular female principal could only listen and try to comfort as best she could, but watched in helplessness as students continued their downward spiral. Importantly, I learned that no one was going to rescue me or my school or the community, that any efforts to solve problems or address issues must come from within. Just think about that for a moment, because that's not an isolated example. Next slide, please. The third theme to emerge are the actual impacts, the bodily impacts of emotional labour. We looked at the previous literature and, for example, a 2022 analysis of workers' compensation claims found that educators in Australia have claim rates 74% higher than the average for assault-related injury and 33% higher for mental health. And a key question we want to plant in your heads today, that's already possibly in there for many of you, is would this be acceptable in any other profession? 74% higher than average for assault-related injury. Principals report the impact of the principalship on their body. So principals talked about sleeplessness, fatigue, stress, diabetes, hair falling out, heart attacks, actually being physically bruised in violent interactions, crying and using their bodies as shields during critical incidences. The stories were often traumatic and visceral in their nature, which is, presented some methodological challenges to the team in terms of psychosocial care of us, but more importantly, it's by looking under the hood into what's going on in principals' lives you get this more visceral image of the types of challenges that they face and the effects of that on them and on their bodies and their relationships and those around them. Next slide, please. The final report that we released this year, or the theme 4, sorry, I should say, is the escalation and normalisation of violence. This follows on from what we were talking about previously. Of those testimonies, 64.8% described a critical incident involving physical violence, threats or violence, and gendered violence, sexual harassment, or sexual abuse. So the violence stemmed from students, parents, staff, and community members, and is increasingly seen to be normalised or just part of the job. This normalisation is perhaps one of the more concerning dimensions of our research, that where normally these kinds of interactions might be seen as shocking exceptions, they are in fact becoming uneasily quotidian in their taking place. Emotional labour is compounded by lack of physical and psychosocial safety in the workplace. When a critical incident occurs, principals report increasing admin work, bureaucratic hurdles that can delay their ability to act and leaving them exposed to harm. They also absorb emotional fallout while attempting to maintain their professionalism, this mask, often at a great cost to their mental and physical health. A question that we'll come back to at the end is, principals are expected to have a duty of care towards their staff, but who's watching the principals? Who's caring for the principals? In the interest of time, I'll just quickly skim through the key points of this. This male principal at a rural school was assaulted several times by a student. They'd approached a team to negotiate support before he enrolled, but the team indicated that the principal could do nothing to support it, that the person could not provide support to the principal because they did not have complete paperwork based on what happened at our school. So this is an example of one of those bureaucratic hurdles. And excuse my fumbling there, the testimony is far more critical than I can manage in my flu-ravaged state. The principal remembers getting frustrated and commenting, "So you need our blood before anything can be done?" The basic consensus was that, yes, they needed our experience before we could put anything in place, and everything was couched in bureaucratic terms of denying the reality or minimising it. And this really echoes back to the risk society and the fact that policy is mitigated by risk aversion, but this does not favour the risks exposed frequently by principals themselves, that the attempt to mitigate risk by their employers can sometimes work against them. Next slide, please. There are gendered dimensions of violence. Female principals face disproportionate levels of harassment and gendered violence. There is this societal expectation of women as caregivers that intensifies emotional burdens and self-blame. We often saw male principals suppressing vulnerability, and we think these reinforce harmful norms that they must remain stoic and suppress their feelings. But this is by no means confined by gender. The idea of the heroic leadership prevails, and in fact is starting to bubble up in the literature recently, and commentary in particular, around the roles of principals in their communities in this outdated and frankly harmful model of heroic leadership. But returning to women, analysis of a longitudinal survey of principal class safety, health and wellbeing reports that women school leaders were more likely to experience threats of violence and bullying at work than their male counterparts. Gender, school sector and the role significantly influence the likelihood of experiencing workplace violence. Anecdotal evidence that department personnel and other key education stakeholders may be minimising violence against women principals emerged during our explorations. But we need to keep this gendered element front and centre because it is experienced by different genders in different contexts. So there's examples here from a female leader of a principals association during our stakeholder interviews. When women principals seek support, it can be minimised, perhaps, dare I say, more so when male reports some of these things. This rings eerily true to me personally, because when we're seeing the type of evidence that are coming out within the medical profession about the different ways in which doctors treat their male and female patients, there are really strong echoes of that in our research. There are really strong gendered themes. Next slide, please. The trust deficit is just central to what we've found in this research as far as we think. Our final report was all about principals feeling hung out to dry by their employer. You know, we've mentioned this, that in the previous research, there wasn't follow through, there wasn't support. The principal had to actually demonstrate actual violence before there would be an intervention, which is disappointing. One principal describes how they were left reeling after 2 critical incidents in short succession. A student was abandoned by their caregivers. With the government services slow to respond, she felt responsible for the child's welfare. Later, in an unrelated episode, she received a barrage of abusive emails from a parent. She observes, "I felt abandoned and isolated. My confidence felt destroyed, and I felt hung out to dry, as though I was expected to do these things as part of my role." Now, we need to counterbalance this, the typically grim news of the data, with the idea that principals frequently imparted inspiring visions of the work that they do. They really care. They really want to make a difference. But they're put in these impossible situations where they're required to navigate these extremely complex human and natural disaster-propelled incidences and interactions. Importantly, the principal said that this is not included in my job description, my yearly performance development plan, nor my school review. This is unseen and hidden work that's become intolerable to bear. I'm still coming to terms with my treatment from my employer. And this is the invisible part that we wish to render visible. We wish to render it visible not only as a phenomenon that happens amongst principals, but we want to see it rendered visible within policy, within position descriptions, and within the general public to better understand what it is that principals go through. Things that I can assume that everyone in this room knows about, but that we need to know about more widely, particularly in the ways that we support principals. And Caroline warmed my heart about the diversity of the people within this room, because it is exactly this kind of network that's required to respond to the data that we've found. Next slide, please. And I'm nearly finished. So the 26 reports have come out, and Fiona already gave you a very nice and tidy summary of them. And we would put to this group, as we've put to our government briefings and our union briefings and our briefings with peak bodies, is what is the opportunity cost of doing nothing? If we don't do anything, what's at stake here? And it obviously begins with the well-being of our principals, but it extends right across education to the quality of public schooling and to the types of ways that they can be central and positive and make major contributions to their community. Next slide, please. Finally, very quickly in 2 minutes, the recommendations. We're asking for a root and branch review of principal role descriptions to incorporate principals' first responder role and emotional labour. This is no different to first responder roles that we might see in ambulance services and police. This needs to be conducted comprising a working group of principal associations, unions, and the department. We want to see clinical supervision for all principals at all career stages embedded regularly as part of their professional life course. We want to incorporate designated working groups for principal class members. And we've provided an example there of what a good example might look like. The DWG lead would need to be resourced via allocated workload and extra pay, and potentially trained by a teacher union, PD or equivalent. These would have material benefits as well as protecting our principals. These actions would reduce the cost of principal work cover claims and attrition. We want to see the increased provision of specialist roles and customised services for schools, including behaviour support, disability, mental health and psychological services for students and staff particularly in regional, rural, remote, and highly disadvantaged schools. Now, as we see more widely growing inequity within Australian society and an intensification of social volatilities, both experienced within our local communities and internationally, just turn on the news tonight, then we see the importance of some sort of preemptive interventions now in order to support them, the principals, as they engage these challenges within their micro communities, their schools. Next slide, please. We want to move to a service-first model for schools. We want to see psychosocial risk explicitly in state and territory role descriptions for principals and education staff. Remember our comment before, who's watching the watchers? Principals are required to look out for their schools. Who's looking out for them in relation to psychosocial risk? We'd like to conduct a national summit on violence in schools, with gendered violence perhaps being a major aspect of the summit, of which it sounds like the constitution of this room would be perfect for such a summit, particularly with the diversity of experience and roles. We want to develop a national plan to address violence and abuse against teachers, school leaders and other staff beyond, for example, in Victoria, policies seeking to for people not to cross on some line. You know, don't cross the line and be impolite, which is obviously not enough. We want full government funding of all public schools to 100% of the resource standard. Of course, we've seen a major agreement released recently, but in our own state of Victoria, the payment of the state side has been deferred for a considerable length of time. So while the agreement might be made, we need to be applying pressure on how that money is being spent and where it's prioritised. And we would make a strong argument that the principal sits centrally within the operation of schools and therefore needs urgent attention. Next slide, please. All of our reports are available at this link. If you Google emotional labour Monash, you'll come across those reports, as well as testimonies from principals themselves. You can hear it directly from them because their voice was important. And as Caroline and Fiona raised at the start, this is an activist project. Our team is united in a desire to work alongside all of you to bring about actual change. We've been hearing the data year on year about the declining well-being of principals in Australia. Now we need more action. And so we're reaching out to you, both as co-researchers, but also as activists, as doers in the community. Before I wrap it up, I will hand it over to Jane or Fiona if you've got any final words. Nope.
They are giving you a strong handshake.
Well, look, we thank you all, and Caroline and Elf, very much for your time today. It's a good room. It's a diverse room. You're our people. Let's get on with it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Fiona and Lucas and Jane. That was incredibly powerful and very important work. I can see a couple of questions have popped up for our presenters just to give some thought to that I'll pose in just a moment. While we wait for any more questions to come through, I'd just like to invite all of our audience members to just take a moment to reflect on what you've heard today. Consider your role and consider, what does this research mean for you in your role? What resonated? And perhaps most importantly, what might we do differently? Or what conversations can we take back to our teams as a result of the research that we've heard today? Because as Lucas said, these are the types of questions that this research really invites us to sit with, not just as individuals, but as a system. So we're now going to open up for questions. I'll be drawing on what's coming through the Q&A function, and I'll put each question to our presenters. We do have 10 minutes for questions. So if you haven't posted a question now, you're welcome to do so, or as we engage with this Q&A, if something pops up, please do use that and we'll get to you in just a moment. So and Jane or Lucas, Fiona, whoever would like to unmute to answer to this one, I'm just going to have a look at Krista's comment here, which is a really interesting one that I know has come up in a lot of our research as well. She's curious about whether we've explored moral injury in Australian school leadership and where principals are being placed in situations where they are forced to act against their moral judgment. Would one of you like to speak to that?
I'll kick it off. The issue of moral injury inevitably emerged within the testimonies. And Fiona and Jane, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a specific issue of speaking out against human rights violations and then apply self-censorship to comply with institutional restrictions on free speech was more implicit in the data than explicit. And I think the timing of our research was kind of significant, given that the issue of speech and institutional censorship has grown so significantly in the last 2 years. But if I've missed something, Jane and Fiona? No, nothing to add?
Just to say that it was very much woven, Krista, throughout the testimonies. That was extremely clear, that sense that many principals were feeling that they were having to at times do things that went against their deeply held values and value systems. And not all testimonies showed that, obviously. So we have begun to explore that in one of our publications, but I think it's something that we really want to look at more deeply as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. I know Natalie has answered a question, but Lucas, you did address this. I'm wondering if Jane or Fiona wanted to elaborate on any of this further, given we have so many people in the audience who work as principal advisors, but also as workplace health and safety and rehabilitation teams. We seemed to have, and I hope I'm not butchering what you've said, during incident support from systems seems to be okay, but it's that post-incident support where people are feeling, to use your words, hung out to dry. Are there any recommendations or further thoughts or comments for our audience specific to what we might do differently to support school leaders in Queensland during these times?
Fiona, do you want to jump in there? I can do it. I'm happy to do it, but no. Why don't you start?
Yeah, look, I think what we probably have to contribute to thinking about that is our looking at the Victorian designated work group model and also the clinical supervision model particularly. I'm not familiar with how Queensland is kind of managing this workplace safety issue for principals, so I'd love to hear from the audience, about any of this. But in Victoria, in the last, I'm going to say 5 years, there's been a move towards developing some designated work groups. So they're those health and safety mechanisms that were existing in schools, but that principals were not able to access as freely when it was based in the school. So now in Victoria, we've got designated work groups for principals, which is across a network of principals. So the principals come together in that designated work group and they have a leader in that space to kind of really amplify the importance of workplace health and safety for principals. What we noticed in the research that we did with that group was both how useful it was for helping in particular challenging times or challenging work, but also how powerful it was in raising the profile of the importance of health, work and safety for health-based work and safety for principals, the mechanisms that they had to have the conversations and to kind of raise the profile of that as a valid consideration in their work was really powerful. Yeah, so that's probably the main point that I would take from that. Jane, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, look, I think absolutely. I think the other thing is the kind of notion of psychosocial safety, which is something that I think organisations across Australia are now having to very seriously engage with. So I think there'll be some good stuff that'll come out of that. But one of the things that a third of the principals talked about that sense of feeling hung out to dry. And the thing that made a difference for them was having someone who followed up with them, made the phone call and did a genuine check-in of how are you, and really listened. I'm now quoting one of our people, our quotes from the testimonies. And so rather than that just being a matter of happenstance, an ad hoc thing that maybe sometimes principals get from particular caring managers or whoever it might be, that actually I think needs to be built into the systems, schooling systems across Australia, because this was not a Victorian thing. This was right across all states and territories where principals were reporting this. So I think actually having something very concrete that is a genuine follow-up, not just a tokenistic, 5 minutes on the phone, you're okay, good. And the other thing I'd also say is that sometimes principals, because they are so much caught up in the actual intensity of the incident, which can roll on for a number of months or two, possibly longer, can be much longer, that they often put their own needs aside and say, oh, look, I'll deal with that later, I'll deal with that later. So, not just the sort of 1 or 2 weeks later, but actually scheduling follow-ups, at the 3 month, at the 6 month, and also the anniversary, some of those critical incidents where it was a particularly, horrific one, those anniversaries. So I'll think that along with the awareness and consciousness raising and structural support from a designated working group, and also the importance of supervision, not management supervision, but actual kind of supportive supervision by, say, a social worker or a psychologist, someone, counselling, and that be something that's just part of what you do, that you have afforded to you as an opportunity, rather than you having to seek it out. Because that was the other thing the principal said, is all the stuff's given to us and we're told to follow it up. But so it's just one more thing we have to do on top of everything else.
That was so helpful. Lucas, what could we add to that?
Something really macro, Natalie, something really macro. So last year, Australia's first ever National Climate Risk Assessment was released that has profound implications for all Australians over the next 30 years. Just immediately following on from what Fiona and Jane were talking about, in the sense that we can anticipate more frequent disasters like the Lismore floods within our professional lifetimes. Once in a century could become up to several times a year within the next 30 to 40 years. So advanced planning for what the responses might look like in the manner that Fiona and Jane mentioned needs to be able to look at these schools as key sites that are going to be responding to the kinds of challenges emerging from natural disasters. If system leaders are forward thinking, they will be integrating these portfolios work, the stuff that's done by the Bureau of Meteorology and so forth, into their planning and into their support mechanisms for school principals, because this isn't going away, it's going to get worse.
No, that's a really good point. Now, we've got 2 more questions posted in the Q&A, and I'm hopeful we have time for both. There's one that's been posted just now. Did the research uncover any implications for professional standards and policy expectations that schools develop authentic partnerships with parents at a school community level and in individual student support cases when principals or school staff feel unsafe in their school community, or have trauma experiences, or don't feel confident in their capacity to deal with that conflict with parents, or skills in de-escalation of adults? That's really interesting, because I've noted down this sort of normalization of violence. And Lucas, I know you mentioned from a number of different avenues. So the school leader is then still responsible for connecting and establishing and working with the parents and communities, but yet could potentially be feeling unsafe. Did your research uncover any implications for those professional standards and the policy expectations that say, school leaders, you are accountable for your engagement with communities, even in those moments of crisis?
Take it away, Jane.
Did you
I'll go,
want to?
Fiona.
Well, I'm looking at Fiona just because.
Well, I think, I think just to, start the point, yes, it did. Absolutely, this stuff is front and centre for principals, and it is, what we found is that this was key sites of challenge, of course, and that usually the kinds of supports that they were accessing in those moments were insufficient. But where that kind of, that emotional labour tension comes is that they keep going, in that work, because they're the ones that are ultimately, feeling like the buck stops with them when it comes to it. If they don't do it, who will? There has been, I think, we noticed probably from our policy review and some of the other kind of work that we did, talking to associations, etc., there has been some moves to systems, I think, developing processes that are accessible by principals. But, my taking, and I'll get Lucas and Joan to contribute as well, but is that needs to be amplified, and it needs to be normalised, that this kind of support is triggered rather than sought out. It's triggered through some of the mechanisms that are starting to emerge, but that it's more common that they come into place in these challenging circumstances.
I think some of the departments, and I'm not sure about Queensland, but some of the schooling systems have now, like, this is not the right word, but it's something like a violent incident team. So teams who are there, if you like, to be able to come in straight away and to act quickly. So I think having that sort of gradation, if you like, of support that allows that sort of immediate support. But there are, look, the other thing is, of course, and sorry, we're using Victorian examples, but Victoria has brought in intervention orders, so principals can actually apply for an order to prevent a community member or a parent or whoever, it might be a staff member, for example, but not to come onto the school property if there is danger and risk. And there's not a huge number of those given out, but I think certainly what the principals told us was even knowing that they have that as a backup and a support is really helpful for them. I think the other couple of things I'd mention is around the kind of training to have really difficult conversations, and that certainly was part, I don't know if it still is, but used to be part of the principal preparation program in Victoria, very extensive training around that was helpful. And we do make a series of recommendations about the importance of building parent and community relationships. And I know New South Wales, for example, the Parents Association and the representative from that was on our industry advisory group. They've got some fantastic programs around building those relationships. So I'm trying to map sort of both the proactive as well as the reactive stuff that needs to be there.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I know last year South Australia introduced the barring notice, which was very new. And I know Queensland at this stage doesn't have anything like that in place, but it is a protective and I guess, as you said, Jane, a reactive measure when school leaders are feeling threatened or have had acts of violence or threats made against them and no longer feel safe. But it does beg the question, as Gillian has noted, that trauma response and experience doesn't then go away just because someone is unable to step foot on the premises. So it's that ongoing care afterwards. The last question from Kim, did you find anything about how principals' emotional labour shapes the emotional health of a school community or the culture of the school, or perhaps even conversely in the other way, whether the emotional health of the school community shapes the nature or intensity of the principal's emotional labour?
It's a great question. I mean, we didn't look at that in terms of cause and effect, but certainly I think we could certainly talk. We do talk in the report too about the particular kinds of organisational sites and how they differ, and how they can. And Lucas talked about that briefly. How they can shape the different sorts of emotional labour that people engage in. So as a principal of a low SES school, there's a particular type of emotional labour in terms of how you're having to engage that may look different from someone who's working in a different sort of economic status. Rural principals, remote principals, obviously, in terms of the kinds of networks and connections, the very closeness of close-knit communities. There was some, I guess, gestures towards that, definitely of principals talking about coming into quite dysfunctional communities or dysfunctional schools, which really took a toll on their emotional health and the kind of labour in which they had to engage in. So there were hints towards that, but yeah, we didn't it's certainly something it could be very interesting to look at, I think.
No, that's fantastic. Now, we are out of time. Actually, we are right on time, so well done. But before I close, can I just offer you some thanks to our presenters, Jane, Lucas, and Fiona. Thank you for not just your time today, but your willingness to share and collaborate with us here in Queensland. And also for those of us joining from other states and territories across Australia. We know that the issues explored in your research are not unique to one state. What you're describing and what you've reported on are national issues. So we are deeply appreciative of the work you're doing, but also your commitment to bringing it to Queensland for us to have this conversation. And to our audience, thank you. I hope today's session was informative and that the research has really given you something to think about and to carry forward. I'd encourage you to take a moment now or in the coming days to consider what next? What does this research mean for you in your role? How might it inform the ways that we support or advocate for or walk alongside our school leaders? And finally, thank you to GIER for their ongoing support of Educational Leadership Futures and for making events like this possible. Thank you, everybody, and we will share the recording and slides with you. So thank you, Lucas, for addressing that question in the Q&A. And enjoy your afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us.